I will surrender my position as Empress. Chapter 1. I got married against my will. From AudiNovel. Adele took a look around the Empress's chambers slowly, if anything remained, even a small regret, but she felt nothing. Her heart became surprisingly light when she thought about it. Suddenly, she could hear urgent footsteps and the door slammed open with a bang. Only one person had the ability to act in this manner. The man who appeared beyond the wooden door was insanely handsome, and his shiny blonde hair was disheveled as if he had run. He glared at Adele with sharp, decadent purple eyes. Karl Ulrich is the Emperor of the Echmont Empire and Adele's ex-husband. He narrowed his eyes at Adele's attire and gritted his teeth. "What are you doing?" he asked. His voice was dangerously low and his burning eyes seemed to devour her. Adele shifted her gaze away from him and attempted to leave the room. The Emperor blocked her path and growled, "I asked you a question." Adele's golden eyes flashed defiantly. She had never had the courage to look him straight in the eye. This was what he wanted. She wanted to be brave for once, even if it was a farce. Even if it meant being locked up and subjected to bondage. She took a step back from him and maneuvered toward the door as if she didn't want to answer his question, but before she could cross the threshold, he grabbed her by the shoulders and turned her around. She utterly despised his behavior, but she knew she was powerless against him. The two locked their blood-red gazes on each other. Karl took a step closer and divulged the question he had been meaning to ask the entire time. "Are you going to see him?" He spat. "Are you crawling to Lionel Balder?" The Emperor yelled in despair, but Adele's face grew even colder. He was ignorant until the very end. "No," she replied coldly, "that is unimportant to me. It's critical that I can no longer stand by your side. Where would my Empress be if she couldn't be with me?" Adele burst out laughing at his preposterous question. "Empress, you are attempting to dethrone me," she scoffed. Karl was stunned by her accusation. Adele wiped away the sarcastic smile off of her face and looked at him blankly before whispering. "That's a lot better," she said. Karl froze. He wanted to kneel in front of her and beg her to stop talking. Adele, on the other hand, didn't even give him a chance. "If you didn't," she whispered, "I couldn't have done this." "Stop," Karl croaked. Adele gave him the smile he craved, as seductive as a crescent moon as she uttered the words, "I'll throw away the seat next to you." The Emperor broke down in front of Adele at those words, and she showed no sympathy. "No, you simply cannot. The only place for you is the seat next to mine, and I'll do whatever it takes to get you back there. You're my Empress." Adele spoke with firmness to him who dared to call her the Empress. "I will give up my position as the Empress." A group of people was making their way through the vast wilderness. Large wagons carrying various rare items were lined up, and hundreds of soldiers appeared to be escorting the procession. A large, colorful wagon and two flags hanging side by side stood out in the procession. The flags of two massive empires located across the sea hung proudly on both sides of the carriage. A woman in a brightly colored carriage was looking out her window, seemingly disinterested. She raised her hand and pulled her shiny black hair back, which fluttered in the wind and obscured her vision. Her eyes were then revealed to be a rare gold color that seemed to contain the dazzling sunlight. Adelheid Kotrov is her name. She is the top striker capable of removing the tower's core on her own, and she is the princess of the Imperial High-Trough, no, the one who used to be the crown princess. The soldiers escorting the wagon kept peering out the open window at the foreign princess. She was a woman whose beauty drew people's attention. Adelheid Kotrov, she muttered. Adele laughed as she cynically repeated her name. It is a letter of proposal from Emperor Echmont. Go and make yourself Empress of Echmont. You must have been so worried, Mother, that you couldn't leave me here. Didn't you think you'd be happy? Adele was deafeningly silent in response to the Empress' question. The Empress approached her silent daughter and spoke in hushed tones. Don't you think about that day at every difficult moment? If I had let Lucio die on that fateful day, you would have risen to the position of Emperor of Kotrov. Stop it. Adele pushed her mother away, her eyes tired, but the Empress did not budge. Adele stared at her with sad eyes. Adele, don't you owe your only brother something? Of course, you will remain loyal to Lucio, but what about your future children? Your assistants? Is everyone thinking the same thing you are? You, too, are disturbed. To the Kotrov Empire, your existence is like a sword under the chin. Go after the Empire and your brother. Adele shook her head and took out a small box that had been tucked away in the carriage's corner. Inside the box, a red envelope contained a portrait and a document. Adele lifted the portrait. There was a drawing of a man in Echmont's imperial robes. He was quite lovely. Emperor Karl of the Echmont Empire was in his office, listening to reports about the prospective empress. The servant had relayed the news that Princess Kotrov had safely crossed the sea and arrived at the port. The servant who had reported the details of the dowry sent from Kotrov withdrew and gave the emperor one final sealed document. This is a document pertaining to dowry details. The servant gulped as she looked at the emperor's face. The emperor's face is unbelievably beautiful, but devoid of any emotion. It gave her strange goosebumps. Emperor Karl ripped the envelope's seal carefully, which contained a copy of the document. As he opened it, something fell on the desk. It was a portrait of the empress-to-be. He set the letter he was holding down and picked up the portrait. A woman with black hair that cascaded beyond her shoulders like ebony was staring out of the photograph. Although it was only a portrait, her gaze was so intense that it felt as if it were real. He placed his elbows on the table and held her portrait closely, narrowing his eyes as he examined it. Isn't it common for portraits sent to prospective husbands to be drawn with a gentle smile on their faces? The woman in the picture, on the other hand, tightened her crimson lips and made a strong expression. Her woman's face was etched with the arrogance of someone who had everything from the moment she was born. Karl's lips rose sharply. His eyes became dark and gleaming. It would be preferable if she would come as a woman. Because he only intends a successor from the empress, nothing more. He had no intention of granting the empress's palace even a single power. So he risked crossing the sea to propose to the Princess of Kotrov. He chose people who had no ties to Echmont. Karl returned the portrait in a cold manner. The servant, who was standing outside, knocked and announced a visitor. Karl's face hardened as soon as he heard the visitor's name. Diane's maid. Yes, Your Majesty. Karl sighed and nodded, and the servant quickly let the maid inside who was waiting. What exactly is going on? Karl inquired before she could even say her greetings, and the maid quickly retrieved her business. Your Majesty, the lady has requested assistance. On the opposite side of the Echmont Imperial Palace, a woman had been fussing about her troubles for several hours now. Her golden, wavy hair and pale, sky-blue eyes were a sight to behold. There were several sets of tiaras and ornaments in front of her, all of which were imperial family treasures owned by successive empresses. Despite the fact that she was standing in front of a rare treasure in a magnificent palace, her face was dark and troubled. How long has it been? There appeared to be a lot of noise outside, and someone unexpectedly opened the door and entered uninvited. Only 2 people in this imperial palace could open her door without her permission. Lady Diane Poitiers quickly rose from her seat and turned to the guest with caution. "Greetings, Grand Duchess." Grand Duchess Elizabeth was respectfully greeted by Diane, but her cold gaze was fixed on the royal treasure alone. The Emperor's sister, Elizabeth, returned her focus to Diane. Diane lowered her head, avoiding Elizabeth's eyes, but she dared not turn around. The maids who were standing around the 2 exchanged glances before quietly exiting the room. Once the door clicked shut, Elizabeth took graceful strides around the room and sat down in Diane's chair. Elizabeth spoke to Diane, who was cautiously fondling her fingertips over the treasures of the imperial family that glistened under the sunlight. "Did His Majesty the Emperor retrieve the treasure?" Elizabeth asked. "No, Your Majesty," replied Diane. "Oh, it appears that you did not require anyone's permission." Diane's face was stoic in response to Elizabeth's reprimand. "I didn't bring it in illegally, so don't be concerned, Your Majesty. You are the only concubine who directly decides on the Empress's ceremonial crown. I'm afraid that if the Empire Kotrov finds out about this, a diplomatic protest document will be issued." Diane was focused on Elizabeth. Elizabeth only smiled as she sat back in her chair. Wouldn't it be preferable to have a ceremony hall chosen by her sister-in-law rather than by his concubine? Diane's eyes widened and she blinked in response to Elizabeth's words. Then, with a small chuckle, she burst out laughing. Diane quickly corrected her expression and responded amusingly. "I apologize. I'm not sure if you're eligible since you're the only divorced woman in the Hanna Empire." Elizabeth was angered by her remarks, making her leap out of her seat. Suddenly, the door flung open. "Hi. Want more? AudiNovel. Thanks for your subscriptions. If you are looking for a specific manga novel, leave us a description with the name. Because we want to translate what interests you. They can be spoiler chapters too.